Alright guys, so today my video is about a chemical called SR-17018, which is showing the potential to be a truly revolutionary treatment, not just for chronic pain, but for opioid addiction as well. I'm going to jump right into it because I think this is potentially the most important topic that I have ever talked about online, and I want to make sure that I get the important information to you in an efficient way, okay? So, quick background on opioid addiction is that we have lost more than 1 million Americans to opioid overdose alone since the year 2000. Okay, so that's more than all of the American soldiers who have died in all the wars that we've been involved in since the end of the Revolutionary War put together. Opioid use disorder it has a prognosis comparable to that of the very deadliest cancers, and we don't have a lot of really satisfactory treatments for it. The standard of care right now most of the time is just to give an opioid addict maintenance opioids such as buprenorphine, also known as Suboxone and other trade names, or methadone, and that doesn't work well for a lot of people. There are really serious side effects, and in the long term, people tend to have a lot of trouble staying only on those medications and not using other substances outside of them. Okay, so given the deadliness of this disorder, again, it's the deadliest mental health diagnosis, at least in the United States presently. I have always advocated that we need to put more research and development dollars into experimental treatments. And with SR-17018, which I'm just going to call SR for the rest of this video, we've got a real prospect here. Okay, I've been severely affected by opioid addiction, and I have close family members who have gone through the same thing, who have almost lost their lives through overdose and other complications from using. And I have been in the world of science in one form or another for 20 years now, and so I have kept my eye on the research, and SR-17018 shows more potential to be a game changer than any other substance or treatment that I've heard about for, again, the last 15 or 20 years that I have been struggling so seriously with addiction. So if you don't know who I am, by the way, thank you for joining us. My name is Brian, and I am a former medical student. I am a science teacher and a blogger. I run an addiction and recovery blog called the Concrete Confessional Blog. I also obviously make YouTube videos under the name Neuromancer or Neuromantic, and I should just emphasize right from the outset that I am obviously not a doctor. I left medical school due to my addiction after my first year. So while I did spend years of my life studying molecular and cellular biology and physiology, and I can read the research that I mentioned in this video and understand it at a decently high level, I am certainly not qualified to give medical advice, and this video is meant to be educational in a general sense. It is certainly not meant to take the place of someone consulting with an appropriately licensed healthcare professional about a treatment plan for their addiction. So I'm going to talk more about my reservations and worries with respect to SR toward the end of the video, but for now, let me give that just very genuine, heartfelt disclaimer. Please don't take this video as any kind of indication that you should order SR on the internet right now and use it yourself to try to taper off of an opioid that you might be addicted to. That could be disastrous. Okay, the other thing I want to emphasize is that much of what I say in this video, it's a starting point. Okay, we have several peer-reviewed studies published in prestigious journals that deal with SR's properties, but we don't have any evidence of how it acts in humans yet, other than anecdote from people who are essentially self-experimenting, and there's a lot of sort of limitation in the available studies. There's a lot of contradiction and more questions than there are answers at this point. Okay, so I'm just emphasizing this is a starting point, and I hope that this will be collaborative. I hope in particular the people who are active on the SR subreddit and some other e-spaces where SR is really being hyped, and justifiably it's being hyped right now. I hope that we can work together to find answers to some of these questions that are going to help as SR gets more and more mainstream media attention, and I think that that's coming. I think it's pretty inevitable that we're going to get a pretty big push to bring it to popular attention, and along with that, hopefully some funding for doing studies in human beings. Okay, so I'm going to talk now. I'm going to go through a series of just short question and answer type setups to help you understand what SR is. So first of all, what is SR-17018? What it is, it's a chemical that's a fully synthetic opioid. Okay, if you're wondering where does it sort of fit in, again, it's an opioid, so it's not similar to heroin, morphine, codeine, thebaine. Those are chemicals that are actually found in the opium poppy, and we call those chemicals opiates. Okay. Then we have a lot of derivations of those that are semi-synthetic or synthetic that resemble them in structure but aren't found in the plant itself. SR isn't like that, okay? SR is fully synthetic, and structurally it's a part of a group of opioids that are distinct from all of these other opioids, as well as other fully synthetic opioids like fentanyl and buprenorphine and so on. So structurally, if you've heard me mention benzimidazole, also known as nitazene or Frankenstein opioids in a couple of my other videos, it's a little bit similar structurally to the nitazenes, or again, the benzimidazole opioids, in that it has the benzimidazole ring. So if you've got some OChem background, you'll know that that means that it has a hexene ring, which has 3 double bonds and 3 single bonds. So it's a set of 6 carbons that are just in a sort of like a hexagonal ring on a flat plane. And that benzene ring is bonded to what's called an imidazole ring, which has 5 members, 2 of which are nitrogens. So not super important to understand that chemistry, but for those of you who are interested, I figured that I'd throw that out there. But again, we're talking about a structurally, and as I'm going to get to, in many ways functionally distinct, fully synthetic opioid. Okay, so probably the most important question that we can ask is, how does SR work? And the answer is, we're still figuring it out, okay? But usually when we talk about opioids, we talk about 2 types. We talk about full agonists, which are your traditional opioids like fentanyl and oxy and heroin and morphine, okay? And full agonist means that when it is stimulating the mu opioid receptor, as you increase dosage, the opioid effect, the response of the body, goes up and up and up all the way through overdose and death, okay? That's a full agonist. Now, there are also partial agonists, like buprenorphine, again, also known as Suboxone and many other trade names. Now, partial agonists have a ceiling effect. So you increase the dosage, and you get more opioid effect up to a point. And past that point, again, it's what we call the ceiling effect stage. You can give more and more of the buprenorphine or other partial agonists, but you don't get more opioid effect, okay? So again, traditionally when we're talking about opioids, we classify them as full agonists or partial agonists. Now, what we need to talk about too with SR is that it's what's called a biased agonist. It's this property that makes it so special, okay? And I'm going to really quickly lay out the way that opioids work to help you understand what that means. Biased agonist essentially means when it stimulates the mu opioid receptor, in terms of what happens cellularly, certain pathways, one specific pathway, namely that is activated by traditional opioids, is in fact initiated by SR, but there's another pathway that is not, okay? So to very simplistically describe how that works, a traditional opioid, let's say morphine, it hits the mu opioid receptor on this cell surface of a neuron in your brain. It stimulates the mu opioid receptor, and it activates 2 pathways, okay? One is the G-Protein-Coupled Receptor pathway, and that pathway leads to the painkilling effects. It leads to that sort of warmth and euphoria and calm, and the other opioid effects that we tend to consider like desirable or pleasant, okay? There's a second pathway called the β-arrestin pathway, and that pathway produces the respiratory depression, that suppression of breathing that can kill you in overdose. It produces severe constipation and a lot of the other negative side effects of opioids, and crucially, it produces what we call receptor desensitization, receptor internalization, okay? So that happens, it's sort of like a sports player being benched, okay? So if you suddenly put all of these exogenous opioids into your brain, if you suddenly start taking a lot of oxy or morphine or whatever opioid you're using, your brain is going to try to maintain equilibrium. It's going to try to maintain what we call homeostasis. It senses that system, that opioid receptor system, is being unnaturally stimulated at too high of a level. And so it will bring some of those receptors, it will turn them off and bring them within the cell so that they're no longer available at the cell surface to be stimulated. Now, it's the beta-arrestin pathway that produces that receptor internalization, and crucially, that's what leads to opioid tolerance, which is a huge problem for pain management patients and opiate addicts alike, okay? So that's why over time you have fewer and fewer of these mu opioid receptors available at the cell surface, so you have to take more and more opioid to stimulate the ones that are left, okay? And that tolerance leads to all kinds of problems, including more severe side effects, more severe withdrawal, and again, just the need to continuously take more and more, which is very difficult to manage clinically from the doctor's standpoint too. Okay, so here's the thing about SR-17018. It's a biased agonist. It activates the G-Protein-Coupled Receptor pathway, okay? So it produces the painkilling effects. It produces the euphoria, the calm, the warmth, but it doesn't produce the beta-arrestin. It doesn't initiate, I should say, the beta-arrestin pathway. It doesn't lead to receptor internalization. It doesn't lead to severe side effects, including respiratory depression, okay? So you get essentially a huge bias of the good effects with a very small cost of negative effects. So that's a simplistic way to represent it, but it's a fair way to represent this SR mechanism of action, okay? I want to mention one study, which I'll link in the video description, and it's a study that compares the efficacy, so the effectiveness in different ways, of morphine, oxycodone, and SR. Okay, and what the study found was that in models of inflammatory and neuropathic pain, SR was more effective. It was more potent at killing pain than morphine or oxycodone. It did that. It retained its efficacy even when you gave it to the mice multiple times. So the mice did not develop tolerance to that effect, unlike with morphine and oxycodone, which they very rapidly developed tolerance to that effect for. And also the SR produced quite a bit less respiratory depression than the morphine and oxycodone. So a more effective painkiller in terms of inflammatory and neuropathic pain with less respiratory depression, and also, no need to escalate the dosage over time because you're not developing tolerance. Like, I hope you guys can start to see how incredibly paradigm shifting this could be, again, not just for chronic pain patients, but for people who are already addicted to opiates and opioids. Now, there is a caveat to that study, and I'm going to bring it up because it is important to realize how many of these, these studies are preliminary. I mean, I shouldn't say that. They're all preliminary, but what I mean is how many of their conclusions still need to be revisited. They still need to be substantiated by repeating similar experimental setups in different labs. This is all preliminary is what I'm trying to say. And the caveat that I'm talking about for this study that compared morphine, oxy, and SR, it was that they basically torture mice in different ways to see how these chemicals affect their response to pain, right? And there was one pain model that uses a warm water immersion test where they put the mice's tails, I believe, in very warm water. And now for that painkilling effect, SR did show tolerance. So in other words, like it did protect the mice from the pain of the warm water on their tail to a certain extent, but to keep getting that effect after repeated administration of the SR, you did need to escalate the dosage. So already, even just in a fairly simplistic or relatively simplistic mouse model, we're seeing that certain types of pain might actually show efficacy for SR, but with tolerance rather than without the buildup of tolerance, okay? Having said that, the inflammatory and neuropathic pain models are much more important and relevant for the reasons why most humans would be taking SR, so that's not a huge caveat. Again, just throwing that out there to give you an idea of why I'm so hesitant and why I keep emphasizing how much these are preliminary conclusions. Okay, so my next question is, okay, so I laid out that SR is a structurally unique opioid that's fully synthetic. I've talked about how it works, its mechanism of action, that it's a biased agonist. Why is SR so special? Okay, and it's what I was just getting at, the fact that it activates the G-protein-coupled receptor pathway that produces the positive or desirable effects of opioids without the beta-arrestin pathway that produces tolerance and respiratory depression and other negative side effects. So this is sort of like a molecular Death Star shot. Okay, so there are other biased agonists, and some of them are structurally related to SR. But what they found, for example, when they took a couple of sister or cousin chemicals of SR and they started doing tests in animal models, including mouse models, testing them in vivo, meaning with living mice or whatever other animal they were experimenting on, what they found was, yes, these look like biased agonists in terms of what they do in tissues. So if you're doing an in vitro test where you just have some tissue in a petri dish, maybe it's nerve tissue, and you're giving SR and seeing that it looks like a biased, or I'm sorry, you're giving an SR sister chemical and it looks like a biased agonist because you see evidence that the G-protein-coupled receptor pathway is activated and that the beta-arrestin pathway isn't. Okay. However, when they then took those SR sister and cousin chemicals and put them into mice, what they saw was that they behaved like traditional opioids, usually full agonist opioids. So that apparent bias in the effects in the in vitro studies did not manifest itself when they moved them over to animal models. They started behaving like traditional opioids with the same risks and, sort of pro to con ratio and that kind of thing. So there are other biased agonists that are known. Again, some of them are structurally related to SR. However, none of them have held up when they were moved over from in vitro tissue tests to in vivo animal tests. Okay, so SR is showing evidence that it could be like, again, what I'm calling a Death Star shot, that it could be a really beautiful example of a biased agonist that gives us 90% of what we want and only 10% of what we don't want, whereas traditional opioids are like 50-50, okay, or even maybe 40 on the good and 60 on the bad side. So this is huge, and we do not have another molecule that is showing this favorable of a bias that's holding up in animal studies right now. Not only everything that I've just said, but also SR has been shown when it's given to mice that are already addicted to morphine, it's been shown to fairly rapidly reduce their opiate tolerance. Okay, so this is potentially a much less painful way of taking people who are addicted to opioids and opiates and bringing their tolerance back to a low level, or maybe even to the level of an opioid naive organism or system that's never been exposed to these chemicals. Okay, and that is groundbreaking if we can achieve that, because that is like full neurobiological recovery. That will get you back to, for lack of a better word, in many ways, at least at the most molecular level, a quote-unquote normal brain. Okay, and the fact that it will so greatly reduce the amount of pain in the withdrawal process is, it's almost impossible to overstate how important that is, because the pain of withdrawal is probably the greatest barrier to people getting off of opiates and opioids. And it is not just a few days of acute withdrawal for maybe a classical opiate like oxy or morphine or fentanyl. It is weeks and weeks of post-acute withdrawal, and more people are getting off of long half-life maintenance opioids like buprenorphine and methadone. I'm currently tapering off of methadone maintenance myself, and that acute withdrawal can go on for weeks and weeks. Okay, so if we have a way to make that process smoother, it could really help people to get back to a healthy neurobiology. And again, pretty much cannot overstate the importance of that clinically. All right, so my next question is, how much do we know about SR? And as I've tried to emphasize, 3 times before I'm answering this question, we don't know nearly enough. Okay, I've read the peer-reviewed studies that are out there, and they are intriguing. They seem to be robustly done, meaning that there don't seem to be huge problems with the studies themselves. But They're sort of the scientific equivalent of WTF. Like every time one research group notes a very special property that SR has and proposes a putative mechanism for explaining why it has that, there's some other finding in the next study that seems to maybe contradict that putative mechanism or that throws another wrinkle into the whole picture. So it's a really confusing information landscape, honestly. Again, I studied molecular, cellular biology, biochemistry for years, 4 years of undergrad and 1 year of med school, and I've read about this my whole life in the context of addiction treatment, and I had trouble with some of this, especially some of the lab techniques for trying to elucidate how SR works at different types of opioid receptors. Those were almost beyond me. I had to do a lot of background reading to be able to process those, which again is unusual for me at this point in my life. So we don't know enough about SR, and we don't have any human tests other than these very brave Redditor, iVolunteerist tribute self-experimenters. Okay, so my next question is about them. Okay, if we read those anecdotes on the SR subreddit, which I'm going to link in the description to this video, what is the sense we get about the early self-experimentations that people are doing using these protocols that some honestly pretty brilliant Redditors have developed because they know how dire the opioid addiction situation is, and they know people need more solutions than we have, and they don't want to have to wait years potentially for the clinical studies to be performed, for the FDA to approve this, etc. Okay, so what we know is that there's a huge amount of promise. There are many people on the subreddit devoted to SR and other e-spaces around opioid addiction who are saying that they were able to taper off of their opioid of choice with much, much less difficulty than they found using a taper using their drug of choice, or a taper using buprenorphine or methadone, or one of the other traditional methods for getting off of whatever opioid you're addicted to. Okay? And I cannot emphasize this enough, there are huge questions that remain, and we cannot ever forget the power of the placebo effect. There is so much hype around this chemical right now that I'm worried that people are overestimating the benefits and that they might not be fully logging the negative effects both on them individually and potentially down the road, the ones that we don't even know about yet, realistically. So, all right. My next question is, what questions do you have about SR, and what reservations do you have when we're talking about, again, the information landscape that's available currently? My first reservation or question is SR basically a partial agonist? Does it have a ceiling effect? Okay, this is really important because if it does, and you give SR to, say, if you suddenly give a pretty strong dose of SR to someone who's dependent on a powerful dose of fentanyl or methadone, you could put them into precipitated withdrawal, which is one of the most unpleasant experiences that a human being can go through. Again, this happened to my friend Jeff, and he said that he thought he had died and his soul was in hell, which is honestly not hyperbolic. It is one of the most excruciating experiences that a human body can undergo. So you could put them in precipitated withdrawal. That's tough on your heart and your other systems. You tend to dehydrate from vomiting and diarrhea. So it can actually be dangerous too, is what I'm getting at. And we need to know, is SR going to work for people dependent on high doses of potent opioids, or is it more kind of a partial agonist where we can use it for low to moderate doses of strong opioids, or higher doses of weaker opioids, maybe like a non-7-hydroxy heavy kratom or codeine, or a lower dose of hydrocodone. So I haven't found a satisfactory answer to that yet, and I would be very hesitant. For example, when I was at my maximum maintenance methadone dose of 203 milligrams a day, I would not be taking SR, and if I did, I would very slowly ratchet up using a microdosing protocol to make sure that my body wasn't responding to this with precipitated withdrawal. Okay, so that's my first question. My second question, kind of along with that, is will it be effective for people on high doses of potent opioids? Because again, the most common, at least illicit opioid being abused right now is fentanyl, which is ultra powerful. It clings to the mu opioid receptor with incredible affinity, and if SR is going to not be effective against someone in that situation, it's got limited clinical applications compared to what would be possible otherwise. So there are things you can do, even if that ends up being the case. You can do microdosing, like I said. You can do a bridge taper. You can use a bridge molecule, but it is going to limit the efficacy somewhat if it turns out that we can't use it on the sort of more severe addicts, because these days so many more people are addicted to the most powerful opioids like fentanyl at high dosages, far beyond what you would usually get, for example, in a pain management context, even in a situation like hospice and palliative care. So those two together are my first sort of reservation, okay? Now, the next thing I want to mention is how much is the power of placebo playing into this? Because when I look at the SR subreddit in general, and if any of you are watching this, guys, you have done amazing work, and I commend you for that. But I do hear a lot of comments by some of the frequent users that they are so excited about this that I'm not sure if they could objectively analyze how the SR affected them, and if they could adequately take into account the cons and the negative effects. I mean, you cannot overstate the power of the placebo effect. One of my favorite studies about the placebo effect was, it would never pass institutional muster these days, but they took a bunch of college kids in the 70s and they gave half of them speed, amphetamine. They gave half of them barbiturates, really, really heavy downers, okay? But they lied to some of them. They told them they were getting the opposite chemical. And out of the people who were lied to, who were told that they were getting speed when really they were getting the barbiturate or vice versa, over half of them reported effects consistent with what they were told they were taking rather than what they were actually taking. So think about how powerful that was. Their minds were literally doing a 180 in terms of taking what their body was experiencing and, again, just totally going to the polar opposite because that was what they expected. So that is the power of placebo. So again, we need controlled double-blind tests to get past that and see what sticks in terms of the clinical effects of SR. So one example of this is I heard someone discussing they were doing an SR taper that lasted, I think, 7 to 10 days maybe, or 2 weeks to get off of, I don't even remember what their opioid of choice was, but they said they had severe insomnia. They couldn't sleep at all. But then they went on to explain, don't worry about that too much because it's not like normal withdrawal insomnia, okay? It is more like your mind is clear, your motivation is returning, and you are just ready to get up and at 'em. Now that's an example of a subjective interpretation of an objective symptom, okay? So you putting meaning onto your insomnia that can be heavily biased by your expectations and your hopes, okay? Insomnia is insomnia. If you can't sleep, yes, I understand what they were getting at. It's not such an unpleasant insomnia for them. But for the record, when I've been in treatment, I felt that same sort of energy and enthusiasm with my insomnia. It stayed up all night journaling or whatever, like with the light off so my detox roommate wouldn't be woken up. So that is the kind of comment that I see on the subreddit. I see a lot of comments sort of saying that this is a magic bullet, this is a miracle fix. They're building the people going into their SR tapers up. They're saying this is going to be the solution for you. This is the paradigm changer. And all of that means that we are getting heavily biased self-reported experimentation, period, okay? It's almost impossible that among those, say, subreddit or other eSpace users who believe in SR so heavily, it's almost impossible that belief isn't, affecting how they experience the results of that taper. And, again, we can't overstate the power of what the placebo can do for you. So, it's not clear also that because a lot of the people on the subreddits, they're using SR to get off of maybe high doses of 7-hydroxy and kratom, to get off of, I think one post I saw the other week was a 50 to 60 milligram hydrocodone habit. Those are fairly low opioid habits, okay? And it's not clear to me that SR is making it easier for them to taper off of those habits easier than it would be if they just did a methadone or bupe taper on an ultra rapid time scale, or even if they just used their chemical of choice if they were able to taper off. So we need that comparison, that double-blind comparison. Without that, it's very difficult to assign heavy value to these anecdotes. As brave as these individuals are, and as much as I can sympathize and empathize with the situation there and the desperation and the hope and wanting to save their own lives, like, we've got to take it with like not just a grain but like a shaker of salt at this point. Okay, now the next thing that I want to mention is the most important caveat to this whole deal. Now again, there's a study of SR being used in mice that shows that SR drastically, pretty rapidly decreases the opiate tolerance of these morphine addicted mice. Okay, now that sounds great. Again, it's your brain healing, it's your brain returning to an opiate naive state. Okay, and that's fair. But the problem is, if you use SR to taper off and then you use your opioid of choice, it is incredibly easy to overdose in that situation. So traditionally, a lot of addicts have died immediately upon getting out of, say, 30-day residential rehab. They've died because they got out. They knew that their tolerance would be lower, but maybe they only, decreased what they typically used by 50%, and that wasn't enough, and they were found dead the next morning. So SR could set people up for a similar failure, and it could do it potentially even more efficiently in terms of getting people's tolerance down faster compared to, say, even like, the traditional methods of detox. So you got to really think about that because, yeah, you can get your brain back to maybe an opioid naive state, but you can't erase all the higher order addictive conditioning. You're going to have cravings. You're going to have drug dreams. You're going to have, this is your main coping skill as an addict. Many of us have had this as our only effective coping skill for years or decades. It's incredibly difficult not to relapse, particularly on opioids, which are some of the hardest drugs, if not the hardest drugs to get off of in terms of the percentage of people who succeed at that. Okay, so it is really dangerous to reset people's tolerance, and I cannot emphasize that enough. So if you are someone who uses SR on yourself, please, God, keep that in mind. If you are going to relapse afterward, you should probably not even use like a small fraction of what you would ordinarily use. You should really start out with a microdose to make sure that you're not overdosing yourself. All right. All right, the other thing is, as far as I know, in terms of where people are sourcing this, it's largely chemical manufacturers that they're finding on the dark web, and they're getting, lab grade SR that is not being developed according to the standards that the quality control standards that we would normally expect for human pharmaceutical products. Okay. Now, inevitably, some of these suppliers are going to be sketchy, so you got to worry about fraud. You got to worry about them giving you fent or carfentanil because it might be cheaper and it's more prevalent, and they think you're not going to care. You're getting high on an opioid one way or another. You got to worry about fraud, even if they're legitimate and they're sending you SR. You got to worry again about failures in quality control, maybe contamination with a substance that could do God knows what to you, could do literally almost anything, and also problems with getting consistent dosage if you're going to take it in the long term for pain management and things like that. So all kinds of concerns around not getting a truly pharmaceutical grade product, which I think I don't need to elaborate on too much. I think everyone can probably see those red flags too. Now, a sort of more subtle point that I think is scientifically really important is that the mu-opioid receptor is the receptor that we associate with traditional opioids and with opiate and opioid addiction. And that's fair. But every opiate and opioid has some receptor spread, okay? There are also delta and kappa opioid receptors, and those have different effects compared to the mu-opioid receptors. Those are involved in addiction to your opioid of choice. Every opioid, again, has some unique effects. So, for example, methadone has some clinically significant NMDA receptor antagonism that is biologically and clinically significant again. So when you suddenly use SR, let's say in the best case scenario, to get off of methadone, you haven't accounted for all those other pathways, like the NMDA pathways that you've been, in this case, antagonizing. So you've been doing the opposite of stimulating those for the entire time you've been on methadone. And you're going to potentially have pretty serious withdrawal from those pathways as your body scrambles to adjust to the sudden change of status quo. So you got to think about that too. Okay, so withdrawal and returning sort of neurological healing, I should say, it's more complicated than just resetting the mu opioid receptor system. Very complex biochemical and physiological process, and I'm very leery of any solution that proposes to be a magic bullet fix. There are certainly medications you can use that will facilitate the process, that will make it faster or less severe. We've had comfort meds of various types to use in that way for a very long time. But withdrawal is physiologic work. Okay, healing is physiologic work. And I'm just remembering, I'm not a 12-step guy, but I'm remembering that warning to avoid the easier, softer way. And in some ways with SR, I have just this vague unease because I just keep feeling it's too good to be true. And there are going to be some pitfalls that we can't even anticipate at this point. Okay. Now, one thing that I just kind of touched on tangentially that I should mention is on those Reddit stories about people using SR to taper off of their opioid of choice, most of those people, as I'm going to get to in my case study in a second, most of those people used benzos, they used weed, they used clonidine and gabapentin and other substances to sort of smooth out the process as they switched over to SR and then tapered off the SR. Okay, so there's all kinds of confounding effect from people using other comfort meds or whatever you want to call them during the withdrawal process. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, so my second to last question is, do you know anyone who's used SR to get off of opioids? And my answer is yes. So I had a regular reader, longtime reader of my blog, who also watches my YouTube videos. He messaged me before he started his SR taper. It was coming in the mail and he was so excited. He asked me what I thought about it and I gave him a very, very cautious answer, but he was determined to do it. So now he has been using pretty high potency opioids, pharmaceutical opioids mainly, for quite a long time. Okay, so he's in his 40s and he's had an opioid and sedative hypnotic dependency for quite a long time now. Okay, so he used SR, I want to say it was maybe a 7 or 10 day taper, and he did feel that it was a smoother way to get off of what he had been taken than the things he had used in the past, like buprenorphine or like methadone. Okay, so he was really excited at first. However, again, the caveat that I just mentioned, he was also taking benzos here and there and a soma or two to get him through the night, to help him sleep, to relax his muscles. So that will confound the effect of the SR. And also, after he was finished with the SR taper, he ended up having to take a small dose of buprenorphine. I don't know exactly what it is, but I would say 2 milligrams or less per day, because he had ongoing withdrawal symptoms. So the for what it's worth, the most prominent one was restless leg syndrome that just would not go away after he finished tapering off of the SR. So he did not have a magic bullet kind of experience, but he did have an experience that again shows that like there might very well be something to this. It might be better than the options that we currently have, and we definitely should be looking into this again with, hopefully robustly funded, properly double-blind studies about the role of SR in both pain management and in getting people addicted to opiates and opioids off of those substances and helping their nervous systems to heal. Okay, so he is about, I'd say, a month or 5 weeks out and still taking that daily dose of buprenorphine. So as for what that's worth, there's my personal anecdote that I heard from someone who I have high confidence is telling me the truth as he's perceiving it. All right, so my final question is, what's my preliminary verdict and what's next with SR? Okay, so just to wrap things up quickly, I strongly believe that there's enough promising evidence to support, to merit human trials of SR, okay? I think there are two possible ways it could go. One way is that it ends up being kind of similar to buprenorphine. There's a study in non-human primates where buprenorphine and SR showed very similar effects. Now that study was looking mainly at like scratching behavior and some other effects. It wasn't directly measuring like the painkilling effects, but the primate study did show a lot of similarities between buprenorphine and SR. So I think one pathway is that SR could end up being like a buprenorphine with slightly different parameters, slightly different receptor affinity and level of receptor stimulation that's clinically useful, but not dramatically, world changing, okay? The other pathway that I've been hinting at throughout this entire video is much more revolutionary, that this could be something that ends up in clinical use for a good majority or at least a sizable fraction of opioid-dependent patients, and which will also change pain management so that people can take opioids rather long-term for their pain-killing effects without having to worry about awful side effects and without having to escalate their dose. So I see the possible sort of ways that this goes as somewhere, in between those two. The nuclear, in my opinion, the worst case scenario is that the government will crack down on SR. It will, make it a Schedule I substance, and it will ban any human study of it. But I don't think that will happen. I think that people have seen the level of devastation that opioid addiction has caused our country, and that we've got an open-mindedness because of that wouldn't have been there necessarily 20 years ago. Okay, so again, my preliminary verdict is I would not be taking SR yet. Okay, I understand the desperation. I understand the level of threat to your life that severe opioid addiction presents, especially in 2025, when not only do we have fentanyl and carfentanil in our illicit opioid supply, we've got xylazine, we've got tranq that's literally people are getting amputations from their limbs rotting off from this stuff. Okay, so I understand the desperation, but desperation can make us rash and foolish, and I feel like a lot of people are going to get hurt if they jump into SR, and really caution you to be careful. I can't tell you what to do. Again, I'm not a doctor, but please be careful. And if you do use SR, make sure you start with micro doses to make sure you don't have an allergy, to make sure that your body is not responding with precipitated withdrawal or some other weird response. So please be careful. I think a slow taper with a very low endpoint is still your safest bet. Maybe using buprenorphine or methadone, depending on how much of what you're using at the start of the taper. And I have all kinds of resources to help you taper, which I'm currently doing myself with methadone. All kinds of resources on both the YouTube channel and my blog to help with that. So thank you all for watching this video, and I guess the only thing I can say is that time will tell. I will be continuing to report back to you guys on SR, and again, I'm hoping that we'll get into clinical trials sooner rather than later. So I love you all, stay safe, and I hope that as we're gearing up for the holidays, everyone is enjoying some time with their loved ones. All right, so I'll catch you guys next time. Thank you.